My parents paid for my brother's law degree, condo, and car, then called him the child who deserved it. When I said I wanted my own business, my father told me, "Build your business without a dollar from us." I left without taking a cent. And years later, my father froze when he saw the name on the building. Before we dive in, we've been putting a lot into these videos, and subscribing is honestly the biggest way you can show support. Doesn't cost anything, just one tap, and it helps this channel grow so we can keep the stories coming. Super grateful to have you here. Okay, let's jump in. My father stopped walking in the middle of the sidewalk on 9th and Franklin, right in the middle of a sentence about something he needed at the bank. The word he was saying never finished. And his hand froze halfway to his coat pocket like he'd forgotten what it was reaching for. He was looking up at something above the entrance of a building on the corner, a 3-story place with a limestone front and glass doors. And above those doors, carved into the stone in letters you could read from across the street, was our last name, Calloway. My mother was 2 steps behind him, and she asked what was wrong, but he didn't answer. She asked again, and he still didn't answer. He just stood there on the sidewalk with his mouth slightly open, reading his own last name on a building he had walked past at least a dozen times over the past year without ever looking up at it. He didn't know the building was mine. Not yet. 6 years earlier, on my 24th birthday, I was standing at the kitchen counter in my parents' house holding a check for $300. My mother had signed it, and my father had written the amount, the same $300 they'd been putting on my birthday checks since I turned 18. My brother Trent was 26 at the time, and he'd just moved into the condo my parents bought him, a 2-bedroom place in a new construction neighborhood with a gate and a pool nobody used. His law school tuition had been paid in full, 3 years at $47,000 a year, and his car was a lease on a sedan my father personally picked out. His bar exam prep course was covered too. I had $400 in my bank account and a business plan in a binder that nobody in my family had ever bothered to read. I put the check on the kitchen counter and said, I don't need it. My mother's face changed when I said it, not to anger but to something softer and more complicated, while my father didn't even look up from the newspaper he was reading. "You're being dramatic," he said. "I'm not. I just don't need it." "Then don't come asking for anything." "I won't." He turned the page, and that was the end of the conversation. I didn't pick the check back up. I walked out of the kitchen and got in my car and drove back to my apartment in a 10-year-old Honda with 200,000 miles on it and an engine that made a sound it wasn't supposed to make. I drove it anyway. When I was 23, I'd put a 40-page business plan on my father's desk. Market research, financial projections, a timeline. He picked it up, flipped to the last page, and set it down without reading the 39 pages between. "This isn't a career, Nate. This is a hobby with a binder." I took the binder back and I didn't argue, because I already knew that arguing with my father about this was like trying to convince a man who only buys blue cars that a red one might also get you where you need to go. Years later, after everything came out, Boyd Hensley's wife told me something that stuck with me. She said she'd been at a dinner party at my parents' house and somebody had asked my father how his boys were doing. He talked about Trent for a solid 3 minutes. Trent's cases at the firm, Trent's new apartment, Trent's upcoming promotion. Then the guest said, "And your other son?" And my father said, "Yeah, Nate's doing his own thing," and moved straight to the next topic before anyone could ask what that thing was. My mother was standing right next to him when he said it. She could have jumped in and said something like, "Nate started a business," or "Nate's been working really hard," but she didn't. She just smiled and refilled the guest's wine glass, and the conversation moved on like I'd never been mentioned at all. That's how it was in my father's world. He talked about Trent at golf, at work events, at client dinners. He introduced Trent to colleagues and had Trent's law school graduation photo in a frame on his office desk. Next to the frame, there was nothing. No second photo, no mention of a second son. I didn't exist in his public life. 2 years after I left, an envelope showed up at my apartment with no return address. I recognized the handwriting immediately because it was my mother's, and inside was a check for $5,000 from her personal account. No note, no letter, just the check sitting in there by itself. I held it for a while because $5,000 would have changed everything at that point. I was behind on rent, eating gas station sandwiches for every meal, and $5,000 would have bought me 2 months of breathing room. But I put the check back in the envelope, wrote "Return to sender" on the front, and dropped it in the mailbox the next morning without cashing it. She never tried again. I found out later that she told my father she'd reached out to me, and he said he made his choice. Neither of them told Trent about the check, so it became this little family secret that proved she knew the gap was real, but thought $5,000 sent in secret without ever confronting my father or saying a single word to anyone was enough to close it. The night Trent graduated law school, my father booked a private room at a restaurant called Harlan's for 35 people. White tablecloths, candles on every table, the kind of place where they fold the napkins into shapes and the waiter introduces himself by his first name. My father stood at the entrance to the private room and shook every guest's hand as they walked in, and he introduced Trent to each one of them. "This is my son, Trent, the new lawyer." Trent stood next to him in a navy suit, smiling and shaking hands while guests filed past. Boyd Hensley, my father's business partner and oldest friend, I showed up with a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget and clapped my father on the back like they'd just closed a deal together. I came in through the main entrance because nobody was waiting for me at the door. I found the private room on my own. And when my father saw me, he nodded once from across the room and went right back to his conversation with Boyd. He didn't introduce me to anyone, not to the law firm colleagues, not to Boyd's wife. One of the colleagues spotted me standing near the door and said, "And you are?" "I'm Nate, Trent's brother." "Oh." He paused for a second. "What do you do, Nate?" "I'm starting a business." "Ah." He nodded politely and turned right back to his conversation like I'd told him I collected stamps. Boyd clapped me on the shoulder when he saw me. "Hey, kiddo." "Oh, good to see you." He moved on within 10 seconds, which turned out to be the longest conversation I had with anyone at that end of the table for the rest of the night. My seat was at the far end, near the kitchen door, not near my parents and not near Trent. I was in the chair closest to the swinging door where the waiters came in and out carrying plates, and the man next to me was a cousin I'd met twice who spent most of the evening on his phone. At 8:15, my father stood up and tapped his glass with a knife, and the room settled into that polite attention people give when they know a toast is coming. He held the glass at his chest and looked around the room, making eye contact with Boyd, who was already smiling, and then with my mother, who had her hands folded on the table. He didn't look at me. Friends, family, some of you have watched Trent grow up. You've seen him work. You've seen him push through when things got hard. And tonight, he's officially done it. He's a lawyer. The room applauded, and Trent grinned from his seat beside our father. I've always believed that a parent's job is to invest in the children who earn it. And tonight I want to raise a glass to the child who deserved it. Boyd laughed first, a big warm laugh that told the room it was okay to laugh along. My mother smiled and clapped lightly, and Trent shook his head and said, "Dad." In that way, people say it when they want to look embarrassed but aren't really embarrassed at all. Half the table laughed and the other half smiled politely. I had a glass of water in my hand, and I kept it exactly where it was while the waiter came through the kitchen door behind me with a tray of appetizers, and the door swung close enough to brush my shoulder. I didn't flinch. "To Trent," my father said, and glasses clinked around the room. I raised mine and drank. After the toast, Boyd leaned over to my father and said something I couldn't hear from my end of the table, and then he said it louder so people around them could catch it. "Beautiful, Douglas. You backed the right horse?" More laughter from that side of the room, and I just kept eating because there was nothing else I could do from the chair by the kitchen door. That phrase, "the child who deserved it," wasn't even new. He'd used it 3 years earlier at Thanksgiving, right after Trent got into law school, and I'd heard it then too. I said nothing then, just like I said nothing now. The graduation dinner was just the first time he said it in front of 35 people while Boyd Hensley poured wine that cost more than my car payment. At the end of the dinner, my father pulled out an envelope and slid it across the table to Trent. Trent opened it, and inside was a set of car keys along with a card that had a photo of a brand new sedan printed on it. My mother clapped like she'd been waiting all night for that moment, and Boyd raised his glass one more time and said, "The kid earned it." My car, the Honda with 200,000 miles, was sitting in the restaurant parking lot. I'd driven 3 hours to be at that dinner, and I'd paid for my own plate. $85. And when the waiter came to my end of the table, I put my card down and he ran it separately, while my father paid for the other 34 people at the table, including Boyd, including the cousin on his phone, including the tip. He did not pay for me, and nobody noticed. Trent knew what was happening. Maybe not the exact numbers, but he knew his condo was paid for and his car was a gift and his tuition was covered. And he knew I got a $300 birthday check while sitting near the kitchen door at his celebration. He'd known for years, and he never once said anything like, "What about Nate?" because his comfort required his silence, and his silence required him not to look too closely at the math. I drove home that night. 3 hours on the highway with the Honda's check engine light coming on somewhere around the second hour, and a vibration in the steering wheel that made it pulse in my hands every time I went above 60. Somewhere past the second toll, a truck passed me on the left, and the draft from it shook the entire car, but I kept my hands at 10 and 2 and drove through it without turning on the radio or calling anyone. The car lasted another 8 months before the engine quit on me for good in a grocery store parking lot. 2 weeks after the graduation dinner, I sat across from my father in his study. The room smelled like leather and the coffee he kept in a thermos on his desk, and his diplomas were on the wall behind him with Trent's law school acceptance letter framed right next to them. There was nothing of mine on any wall in that house except a soccer participation trophy from the 4th grade that my mother kept in the hallway closet. I told him I was going to start a property management company and that I had a business plan, and that I needed $30,000 for a lease deposit on a commercial space. He leaned back in his chair. "Nate, I already told you what I think about this. I'm not asking what you think, I'm asking for a loan. I co-signed a mortgage for your brother 2 months ago. $210,000, because I believed in what he was building. Do you want to know why I believed in it? Because it had a structure, a path, a name. I have a structure. You have a binder." He looked at me across the desk, and his reading glasses were sitting between us. He picked them up and put them down, which was a thing he always did right before he was about to say something he considered final. "Build your business without a dollar from us. Prove it works, then we'll talk." I stood up. "Fine. Fine? Fine." He looked surprised, not because I'd said fine, but because I'd said it without pushing back or negotiating or sitting back down to talk about terms. I left the study and I heard his chair creak as he leaned back, and then I was in the hallway and out the front door and in my car. He didn't think I'd do it, and I could see that clearly on his face. He expected me back in 6 months, ready to talk about law school or something he could understand. That same week, he told Boyd about the conversation over drinks at a bar they'd been going to for 20 years, and Boyd shook his head and said, "You backed the right horse, you Douglas." He said it again the following month at a dinner party, and again at a golf outing 6 weeks after that. Multiple people in my father's social circle heard the phrase, and they all understood what it meant. Douglas had 2 sons, he'd bet on one, and the other one was on his own. 3 weeks after the ultimatum, I walked into a bank with a marble lobby and a security guard at the door and sat across from a loan officer named Terry in a small office with a fake plant in the corner. I had the business plan in the binder, all 40 pages, and I slid it across the desk. Terry opened it, flipped through a few pages, paused on the financial projections, and then closed it like he'd seen everything he needed to see. "Mr. Calloway, I appreciate the preparation, but we typically don't extend commercial loans to applicants without an existing revenue stream or collateral. The projections are on page 31. I saw them. They're optimistic. They're conservative." He gave me the kind of smile people give when they think you're young and don't know what you're talking about yet, which was the same smile my father had given me when he called the plan a hobby with a binder. Different office, different man, same conclusion. "I'm sorry. We can't approve this at this time." I picked up the binder and walked out and sat in my car for 5 minutes with it on the passenger seat. Then I drove to another bank, and they said no too. The third place I tried was a credit union on the east side with one branch in a parking lot that needed repaving. And they said they'd consider it if I could put down $15,000 instead of $10,000. I had $11,000 saved. I sold the Honda for $4,000 to a mechanic who said he could fix the engine sound, and I bought a bus pass. I took the bus to the credit union and signed the loan paperwork at a desk that was smaller than my father's desk by about half. At 25, I signed a 36-month commercial lease on a small storefront in a neighborhood called Ridgeline, where the rent was $2,400 a month. I signed it at a folding table in an empty room using a cheap ballpoint pen from the credit union, and that lease was the most expensive thing I had ever committed to in my life. My first tenant was a man named Phil Gutierrez, who ran a small printing shop. He'd been looking for space for 3 months when a friend of a friend told him about the storefront I was trying to lease out, and he came to see it on a Tuesday afternoon. The space was clean but completely empty, with no finished walls, no signage, and marks on the floor from the previous tenant's shelving that I hadn't been able to fully scrub away. I walked him through the unit and the bathroom and the small storage area in the back, and he asked practical questions about the lease terms and the utilities and the parking situation. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked me. "About 4 months." 4 months. He looked around the empty room with a folder of his own under his arm, his own projections and his own plan. And because he was 42 and starting over after divorce, and he needed a cheap space just as badly as I needed a tenant. "Anyone else in the building?" "You'd be the first." He looked at me for a few seconds, a 25-year-old in a building with no tenants and a folding table for a desk, and most people would have walked right back out the door. "I'll take it," he said. He was the first person who bet on me when betting on me made no financial sense at all, and I didn't tell him that because it would have sounded desperate. I just gave him the lease and shook his hand, and his rent check arrived on the 1st of every month for 3 straight years without a single missed payment. By month 14, the second unit was still sitting empty, and I'd been covering the difference out of my own pocket until there was almost nothing left. And I had $200 in my account, and I was eating from a gas station 3 blocks from the office because the sandwiches were $3.50 and the coffee was $1. I hadn't bought new clothes in 7 months, and I was wearing the same 3 shirts in rotation, washing them at the laundromat on Sunday nights. The plumber I'd hired to fix a pipe in the basement wanted $600 I didn't have, and the utility company had sent a notice that was starting to look like it might become a shutoff letter if I waited another week. Every morning I was mopping the storefront floor myself at 7 a.m. because I couldn't afford a cleaning service, and the mop handle was held together with duct tape while the bucket leaked a trail of water behind me wherever I went. I sat at the folding table, which had become my desk by default, and I looked at my phone. I could have called my parents, or I could have called Trent. I could have said, "I need help," or "You were right." And the $5,000 my mother had already tried to send would probably show up again, except this time with my father's signature on a bigger check and a condition attached that would feel like charity and taste like defeat. I put the phone face down on the table and picked up a list of commercial real estate contacts I'd been building for months. I started cold calling, and on the 7th call, a woman who ran a small accounting firm said she was looking for office space. She came to see the building the next day, and the space was clean because the mop worked even if the handle didn't. She signed a lease that Friday. That weekend, I paid the plumber and paid the utility bill and had $14 left. And I ate a gas station sandwich for dinner and went to bed at 8:30 because there was nothing else to do, and the lights in my apartment were on a timer I'd set to save on the electric bill. By year 3, I put an ad in the paper for an office manager. It was 12 words long. Small property management company seeks organized person, low pay, high responsibility. 3 people applied and 2 of them didn't show up for the interview, but Connie Marsh did. She walked into a building that still had a folding table for a reception desk, a second-hand filing cabinet I'd bought from a thrift store for $40, a water stain on the ceiling I hadn't gotten around to fixing, and a phone that was the kind with a cord. "What's the salary?" she asked me. I told her a number that was honest and low. She looked at the folding table, and then at the water stain, then back at me. "I've worked for worse. When do I start?" She started Monday, and within 6 months she knew every property by its furnace model. She knew which tenants paid early and which ones needed a reminder call on the 2nd of the month, and she kept a binder of her own that was more organized than mine ever was. I told her once that she was the most organized person I'd ever worked with, and she said, "You're the most stubborn person I've ever worked for. It evens out." By year 4, we had 3 properties, and by year 5, I'd secured financing for the new building from the same credit union that had given me my first loan. The loan officer looked at the financials and said, "Mr. Calloway, this is a completely different company than the one that walked in here 6 years ago." And I told him, Same company, same guy, more buildings." The building was going up on 9th and Franklin because It was the right block for a commercial property, with good foot traffic and proximity to the business district, and a bank on the same block that brought steady pedestrian flow. I didn't choose the location because my father banked there. I didn't even know he banked there. The coincidence wasn't part of any plan, and it didn't need to be. It took 14 months to finish the building, with all the permits and inspections and delays that come with construction, including a concrete supplier who went out of business halfway through the foundation pour, and a week in February when the temperature dropped so low the crew couldn't pour anything, and I just stood on the empty site watching my schedule slide. But eventually, it was done. I'm 3 stories with a limestone front and glass doors, a real reception desk, 12 employees, and Connie at her desk every morning before anyone else with the coffee already made by the time I walked in. The name went up on a Tuesday. I'd been walking past the building for weeks watching the crew finish the facade, but that particular Tuesday the stone carvers mounted the letters. Callaway, cut into limestone above the entrance, at eye level for anyone who paused to look. I stood across the street and watched them finish, and the foreman came over wiping dust off his hands. Looks good. That a family name? It is now. My father had been banking on the same block for 30 years, parking in the same garage and walking the same sidewalk. He had walked past the construction site and past the permits posted on the fence and past the framing going up and past the limestone facade being set into place. And he never once looked at any of it. He walked past his own son's building for over a year the same way he'd been walking past my life for 6 years, without seeing it. Until that Thursday when he was walking to the bank with my mother and something made him look up. I wasn't there when it happened, but I heard about it later from Trent, and then again from my mother months after that. He stopped on the sidewalk and his hand froze halfway to his coat pocket and his mouth opened slightly without any words coming out. My mother asked what was wrong, and he didn't answer, so she followed his eyes up to the letters above the entrance and read them. And then she put her hand over her mouth and lowered it and read them again. He shook her off when she touched his arm and stepped closer to the building. He read the smaller text below the name, the address, the company name, Callaway Properties, LLC, and then he looked through the glass doors at the reception area where people were working at desks, and there was a framed photo on the wall that he couldn't quite make out from the sidewalk, but that was clearly a photo of this building during construction. He took out his phone and stared at it and put it back, and then took it out again because he didn't know who to call. The person he would normally call about something like this was Boyd, but what was he going to say? My son built a building and I didn't know about it? My mother said his name. Douglas? He didn't answer. So she said it again. Douglas, we should go. He turned around and walked back to the car without going into the bank, and my mother followed him. They drove home without speaking, and he went straight to his study and closed the door while my mother sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee she never drank, thinking about a $5,000 check she'd mailed years ago and a son who'd sent it back without a word. Trent called me on a Wednesday night, and we hadn't spoken in about 5 months. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Okay. Is that building on 9th and Franklin yours? Yes. He went quiet for a long time, maybe 10 seconds, maybe 15, and I could hear him breathing on the other end. Dad saw it. He was walking past it with Mom, and he just stopped right there on the sidewalk. Mom said he didn't talk for the rest of the night. Okay. Nate, I didn't know you were doing all this. You didn't ask. The line went quiet again, and he tried to fill the silence. I mean, I knew you had a business. I knew you were doing something with properties, but a building? With your name on it? I had no idea. Our name, Callaway. It's our name, not just mine. He didn't know what to do with that, so he tried again. Are you doing well? I'm doing fine, Trent. I should have called sooner. I should have asked what you were working on. Yeah. I'm sorry. Thank you. He called again the following week, and I picked up, and we talked for about 9 minutes. He asked careful questions about the business and the building and how long it had taken, and I gave him short answers. He didn't mention the graduation dinner or the toast or the car keys or the $85 plate I'd paid for near the kitchen door, because those things were still sitting in the room between us even though neither of us was saying them out loud. Boyd Hensley found out the same week when somebody in his office mentioned the new Callaway building on Franklin, and the way they said it made Boyd's coffee cup stop halfway to his mouth. He drove past the building that afternoon, parked across the street, and read the name carved into the stone above the entrance. He sat in his car for a long time because he was remembering things. He was remembering the graduation dinner toast that he'd workshopped with my father over drinks the week before it happened. He was remembering his own laugh, the first and the loudest in the room. He was remembering the phrase he'd been repeating at dinner parties for 2 years. You backed the right horse. And now, the horse that supposedly wasn't worth backing had a 3-story building on the same block where he and my father had been banking together for decades. He called his wife that evening and said, "I think Douglas has a problem." The following week at a golf outing, one of the other men in their group said, "Did you see that building on Franklin? Callaway Properties? Douglas's kid, right?" Boyd nodded. "Not the lawyer, the other one." "Yeah. I thought Douglas said the other one wasn't doing anything." Boyd didn't answer that. He just lined up his shot and hit the ball and didn't say much for the next 2 holes. He tried calling my father, but my father didn't pick up. And over the following weeks, Boyd became busy every time my father suggested lunch, and then busy again when he suggested golf. Their 30-year friendship didn't end with a conversation or an argument. Boyd just quietly stopped showing up, and my father noticed but never asked why, probably because he already knew the answer. My father called the city's business registry from his study with the door closed. He asked about Callaway Properties LLC, and the registrar confirmed that the registered owner was Nathan Callaway, that there were 7 commercial properties, and that the company had been incorporated 6 years ago. He asked her to repeat the number of properties, and she said 7 again, and then he asked if there were any co-owners or partners listed, and she said no, single member. He said thank you and hung up and sat there for a long time. When Boyd finally did talk to him, my father tried to reframe the whole thing. "I always knew the kid had something in him. I just wanted him to prove it on his own." Boyd didn't respond, and the reframe just hung in the air between them like a check nobody wanted to cash. Around that time, Connie was having coffee with a business contact from the East Side, and the contact asked about the company's history. Connie told him the truth. "I've been with Nate since there were 2 of us in a storefront with a folding table for a desk. No investors, no family money, not a dollar from anyone. He built this whole thing with a cold call list and a bus pass." That contact mentioned it to someone at a Chamber of Commerce mixer, and that person mentioned it to someone who golfed with Boyd, and the quote worked its way through the social circle within a month. Not a dollar from anyone. That sentence did more damage to my father's reputation than anything I could have said myself, because it answered the question everyone had been asking since the building went up. Did Douglas help? And the answer, coming from someone who had actually been there from the beginning, was no. At Trent's law firm, one of his colleagues brought up Callaway Properties during a meeting. "They're becoming a serious player on the East Side. 7 properties now. You know who runs it?" Trent's hand tightened on his pen, and he kept his eyes on the paper in front of him. "Nathan Callaway. Same last name as you, Trent. Any relation?" He could have said yes. He could have said, "That's my brother," and felt something like pride or at least honesty. Yeah, but instead he said, "I've heard the name," and moved on to the next item on the agenda. He sat through the rest of the meeting for another 40 minutes, and later that afternoon he went into his office and closed the door and sat at the desk his parents had helped him buy, in the career their money had helped him build, and he stayed there for a long time without doing any work. My father left me a voicemail on a Sunday morning, and we hadn't spoken in over a year. The voicemail was 11 seconds long, and all he said was, "Nate, call me back. I need to talk to you about something." His voice sounded different from how I remembered it. Not angry and not cold, but something closer to confused, like a man reading a map and realizing he's been holding it upside down. I listened to it twice and didn't call back that day. I called back on Tuesday. "Is that building yours?" he asked. "Yes." "Why didn't you tell us?" "You told me to build it without a dollar from you." "I did." He was quiet for a while, and then he said he wanted to meet. I said okay. We met at a diner halfway between our houses, a place with vinyl booths and coffee that came in a ceramic mug. He was already sitting there when I walked in, and he stood up when he saw me, which was something he hadn't done in years. He had a newspaper clipping on the table, a short article from a local business publication about the building on 9th and Franklin. He slid it across the table toward me and said, "I had them print this for me. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I didn't pick it up, and it just sat there between us next to the salt shaker while the waitress poured coffee. Yet he wrapped both hands around his mug and didn't drink from it. He started to say something, stopped, and then started again. I made a mistake. Which one? He looked down at the table. The money. The way I handled the money. Your brother got more than he should have and you got less. I see that now. What else? The toast. The graduation dinner. What I said that night. What else? He opened his mouth and closed it and tried again. The way I talked about your brother to people. How I... He trailed off and picked up the coffee mug and set it back down without drinking. I should have mentioned you more. You didn't mention me at all. He didn't have a response to that because there wasn't one. 6 years of never saying my name at a dinner party or a golf game or a client lunch. Even 6 years of treating Trent like his only son in every room that wasn't their own kitchen. He couldn't name it because naming it would mean admitting it was something he chose to do, not something that just happened. The coffee got cold while he talked some more, half sentences and fragments. I should have, and if I had known you were, and your mother and I both. Things that kept moving in the direction of an apology, but never quite arriving. At the end, he paid, and I let him. We walked out to separate cars in the parking lot, and he turned around once like he was going to say something else, but nothing came out, and I got in my car and drove to the office. A few weeks later, on a Thursday morning, I walked to the office the way I always walk to the office. Down 9th Street, left on Franklin. I passed the bank my father has been using for 30 years, and passed the building with my name on it. Callaway, carved in limestone above the glass doors, at eye level for anyone who pauses to look. The letters were the same color as the building and they didn't stand out because they didn't need to. I didn't pause. I've walked this block 100 times and the name above the door is just my name and the building is just where I work. Inside, Connie was already at her desk with the coffee made and a tenant's note about a lease renewal sitting on the reception counter. A normal morning. My father froze on this sidewalk. He stopped mid-sentence and stood there for a full minute, looking up at the name he told me to build without. I kept walking.